If you want to support independent content like this show, the PlayStation podcast Sacred Symbols, the Retro podcast Knockback, and more, and get perks for doing so, please consider subscribing to Colin's Last Stand on Patreon at patreon.com/Colin's Last Stand. Your support is essential. Thank you. Colin's Last Stand is supported on Patreon, and some months I let the audience vote for what topic they want to see covered on a future episode of SideQuest. Today's episode is one such topic, the 10 most emotional moments in video games. While this list would probably change weekly depending on when I wrote it, Sophia and I have delivered what I believe is a great list of emotional moments we'd highly recommend you check out for yourself. Though be warned, this video is chock full of spoilers. Packing assault rifles with built-in chainsaws, thick armor, and even thicker necks, and gore and testosterone in equal amounts, the Gears of War series is full of beefy masculinity, which makes this moment all the more surprising. It's not often the steeliest among us admit to crying, but hell if the fate of Gears of War's Dominic Santiago didn't make plenty of grown people bawl. Introduced in the first game, Dom is best friends with Gears protagonist Marcus Phoenix, and at first his story is one of hope set against a backdrop of misery. Trying to reunite with his wife Maria, Dom does his best to remain in good spirits and is convinced he will one day find her, a confident determination that towards the end of Gears 2 seems to pay off. Finding her in an underground Locust prison camp, Maria is freed from a small metal processing container. On the verge of his long-awaited reunion, what should have been a happy moment is revealed to be anything but as the veil is lifted. Dom assumed his wife would be healthy, but he instead finds her as an irredeemable and incurable husk. Slowly realizing that she'll never recover, Dom chooses to end her suffering himself. Years later, during Gears of War 3, Dom's fate would yet again take a tragic and more permanent turn, informed by the terrible events of the previous game. Surrounded by enemies, Marcus and his squad find themselves in an unwinnable situation. Seeing that there was only one way out, Dom makes the ultimate sacrifice and blows himself up along with the enemies, saving his friends. Perhaps the game scratched at our emotions a little too literally by playing an instrumental version of Mad World during Dom's final scene, but it's an emotional moment nonetheless, and a sad end to a character whose story is highlighted by tragedy. What Remains of Edith Finch is an existential crisis disguised as a walking simulator. Recounting the deaths of various members of the Finch family, the game is a sometimes funny but often dark look at the suddenness of losing someone you love. From a baby drowning in a bathtub to a young man killing himself, no subject is off limits. Though it's the tale of Lewis's suicide that is by far the most emotional moment in the game. Presented in a beautifully constructed level in which Lewis daydreams while going about the daily monotony of his job at a cannery, this moment is strangely relatable. We've all been caught in despair-ridden loops. Making Lewis's death memorable is the fantastical way upon which his end is presented to the player. Narrated over by a letter his therapist had written his mom to try and help her understand why her son took his own life, she discusses how he became further lost within his imagination, a possible side effect of previous substance abuse and anger towards living an unfulfilling life. During this moment of exposition, the player uses one stick to decapitate fish on the screen while navigating the fictional royal realm where Lewis is eventually crowned king. This gameplay loop perfectly captures what it feels like to be lost within a daydream. As he delves further into his mind, the screen becomes engorged by the royal adventure, until it's nigh impossible to focus on the removal of fish heads at the cannery. Though, unlike most daydreams, this doesn't end with a boss yelling at him, because by this point, Lewis has become far too lost within an imaginary world that brings him more joy than the one his physical body occupies. But he still can't escape reality. As he bends his head down to accept the crown of a king in his daydream, a guillotine cuts not only the royal escapade short, but Lewis's head too, a dramatic end to a character battling severe mental illness. Even years after launch, Spec Ops: The Line remains one of the most unusual and emotional shooters ever made. What begins as your typical third-person action game slowly morphs into a horrifying escapade of delusion, challenging the very notion of what it means to be a heroic soldier killing hundreds of people. It becomes virtually impossible to even track what's real and what's not the more you play. While the plot alone could easily consume its own video, the elevator pitch is that you play as Captain Martin Walker, tasked with the mission of confirming the status of a treasonous, renegade American military officer named Colonel John Conrad. Exponentially complicating the adventure is that very little is what it seems, as hallucinations constitute a substantial portion of everything that's going on, though you certainly won't know that at first. Adding more eerie depth is that, depending on how one interprets the story, Walker is already dead, and everything the player experiences is within the mind of a dying brain coming to terms with its horrible actions, one action of which is the infamous white phosphorus scene. Skulking through a destroyed and largely abandoned version of Dubai, Captain Walker orders his men to fire mortars of white phosphorus at the enemy contingent ahead. After doing so, they proceed forward and discover the soldiers had been trying to help civilians find safety. What follows is a moment of shock as they discover the corpses of dead civilians, including a woman holding a baby. Rarely do video games make us feel guilty for our actions. After all, how many innocent civilians have you gunned down in GTA? We often complete these violent tasks without a second thought. But what makes the white phosphorus scene in Spec Ops absolutely soul-crushing is that it forces the player to question the sheer gravity of their digital decisions. Mass Effect 2 expertly builds tension, culminating in an endgame suicide mission that, for many players, is the finest moment in BioWare's sprawling sci-fi trilogy. Any and everyone in your party, including protagonist Commander Shepard, could die, and that weight is felt in every scene, especially given the lasting impact it could have on your precious trilogy-spanning save file. As you probably know, Mass Effect is special for its relentless emphasis on player agency. Decisions made in the first game carry over to the second, which subsequently make their way to the third. In that sense, it's hard to specifically pinpoint just exactly what makes Mass Effect 2's suicide mission so emotional for everyone, given it could play out and affect the series in so many different ways, but it's pretty much universally considered one hell of a roller coaster ride. At the end of Mass Effect 2, Shepard and his crew make a final push to kill off a threat posed by a nefarious enemy called the Collectors. The powers that be determine that a mission to their base of operations is required, and so much of the game is spent building a team of fighters to aid in this quest. Mass Effect gets its name from the fictional mass relays strewn across the Milky Way galaxy, ancient alien conduits that allow faster-than-light travel. But not all of them deliver ships to desirable locations. Mass Effect 2's Omega-4 relay is special because it leads to the center of the galaxy, and no ship has ever returned after jumping through. This is where the Collectors call home though, so your party has little choice but to risk life and limb. Because you, as protagonist Shepard, are asking so much of your party members, up to and including asking for their lives, it's important you build up trust throughout the game. Failing to accomplish loyalty missions or not properly upgrading your ship, the Normandy, can lead to a chaotic mass relay jump, but even if you game the system and played the title like a completionist, the mission could still end in disaster if certain in-game choices weren't properly thought through. Decisions which made every cutscene tense and scary as the player stared at their TV screen, unable to reach out and save their favorite character in a moment of danger. Equally loved and hated by gamers, Gone Home is an exploration into the coming out of a teenage girl and the purely coincidental collapse of her immediate family. Following Katie Greenbrier as she arrives to her family's deserted Oregon house after a year abroad, Gone Home requires the player to try and discover just where everybody has gone. Set up like a horror game, the player has no idea what's happening until they snoop around and uncover the game's true mystery. While it at first seems like something went horribly awry, Gone Home turns into a tragic story of teenage love against the backdrop of a decaying family's story. Scattered about the house are notes and clues as to the dysfunctional and broken nature of the Greenbriers. Katie's mother is falling in love with someone outside her marriage, and her father is struggling to make ends meet as a writer, instead finding solace at the bottom of a bottle. As for Katie's sister Sam, she's learning to cope with acceptance, as she's a lesbian who doesn't enjoy the support of her family. On top of that, the girl she loves is set to ship out and begin military service, doubling her despair. What makes this experience so powerful is how it plays on inherent human empathy. You don't have to be gay to feel Sam's pain. Who among us hasn't faced scrutiny or denial from a loved one about some vital aspect of our life or who we are? That the Greenbriers happen to be crumbling to a fine dust as all of this is happening is incidental, but deeply relatable for many of us as well. Even the home itself will raise memories within the minds of gamers. X-Files VHS recordings litter the living room, and even cartridge-based games and consoles can be found. The game's 90s setting is an open ode to nostalgia, a feeling that we often talk about positively, but one that actually means painful memory. At the end of the day, Gone Home is a game all about yearning, a most familiar human emotion for all of us. Final Fantasy VI's famous opera house scene is widely considered one of the most iconic moments from an earlier, simpler era of gaming. It's grandiose, majestic, and frankly jaw-dropping, especially considering when it was made. It's a scene so wonderfully executed upon that it's hard to peg just what emotions it stirs most. But one thing is for sure, few scenes in the 25 years since Final Fantasy VI's launch have come anywhere close to capturing players' imaginations and attention like this scene does, even with all the beautiful graphics, orchestral music, and expert writing our industry enjoys today. Taking place within an opera house, who would have thunk it, the scene follows your party as they watch a stage play. With a somewhat goofy setup, the general gist is that the player needs an airship, and conveniently, a wily airship owner named Setzer plans on kidnapping the opera's female lead, who he's enamored with. The opera's female lead just so happens to look like Celis, one of your beloved party members. So your group decides to spring a clever trap. Have Celis play the lead role in that evening's performance, let Setzer kidnap her, and then pursue Celis and Setzer, hopefully commandeering control of that expensive aircraft. Final Fantasy VI deals with a lot of interesting subjects up to this point in the game. greed, brotherhood, and brutality, just to name a few. But its opera scene opens up a new spectrum of emotion, accompanied by wonderful music and MIDI-style vocals that are so quaint by today's standards, but work so well within the confines of a 16-bit adventure. In some ways, this is one of console gaming's very first cinematic experiences, long before cinematics were truly and actually a thing. And the uncertainty surrounding Celis's plight and the glimmer of hope meeting Setzer provides the party injects the adventure with adrenaline as you move through to the next portion of the story. You'd be hard-pressed to name any other studio that handles human interaction quite like Sony-owned Naughty Dog. In their Uncharted series, for instance, Nathan Drake's and Elena Fisher's relationship was believable. They felt like a real couple. We rooted for them, we witnessed their ups and downs, we wanted the best for them. And because it's also pulpy, we always knew it'd work out for the best. The same can't be said for Naughty Dog's other contemporary franchise though, because The Last of Us encourages players to believe in its inner character relationships, only to crush you once you do. It's part of the game's incredibly dire charm. The Last of Us largely takes place years after a dangerous fungal outbreak kills most of humanity, but the beginning of the narrative actually starts at the moment the world begins to fall apart. Protagonist Joel and his daughter Sarah are sitting on the couch one minute and escaping chaos the next. Witnessing their world fall apart is tragic in its own right, especially as minutes earlier, the pair were bonding over a birthday watch Sarah had given her father, establishing the loving and safe relationship the two share and reminding players that yes, once upon a time and not too long ago, all was indeed normal. Crushingly, Joel's and Sarah's dynamic wasn't built to last, and before long we're introduced to soul-shattering anguish as Sarah is shot by a soldier and dies in her father's arms. The profound weight of losing one's child is placed onto us early in the campaign, and it's a difficult burden to carry. This moment also sets the tone for what is ultimately a bleak and distressing experience. The universe of The Last of Us is one that rarely sees happiness, and Naughty Dog stabs us in the heart at every possible opportunity. It also cleverly gives context to the father-daughter relationship Joel later develops with a child who reminds him of Sarah, but isn't her. It's what the game is ultimately all about, and so to see the despair of a post-apocalyptic world, we're first required to bear witness to the despair that kicked it all off to begin with. Calling Red Dead Redemption 2 a long game is a profound understatement. Completing the main campaign can take upwards of 75 hours, and that doesn't even take into account the many distractions Rockstar's masterfully crafted open world throws your way. Thankfully, helping the experience to avoid the pitfalls of boredom is a colorful cast of characters who constantly keep you on your toes, and the protagonist, Arthur Morgan, is your conduit into an ever-changing world he's a complete stranger in. No matter what he does though, you can't help but root for him. He's one of contemporary gaming's most memorable faces and voices. But runtime isn't the be-all end-all. In fact, games are largely becoming too long for their own good, with totally unjustified and repetitive content slowly but surely driving us all crazy. Some massive adventures can easily begin to drag if the person you play as just frankly kinda sucks, but in Red Dead 2, this is most certainly not the case. Arthur Morgan is hands down the best character Rockstar has ever created, making his endgame diagnosis of tuberculosis an incredibly hard pill to swallow. Not that he had many pills to swallow, or perhaps he wouldn't have died so tragically and so unfortunately. Throughout the game, Arthur becomes noticeably more sick. As the player, you know something is up and that the narrative is building to something tragic. You just kind of stave off those thoughts though, because hopefully the obvious doesn't befall you. But it ultimately does. What begins as a lone cough here and there eventually evolves into full-on fits, making it clear that Arthur is on increasingly borrowed time. Frankly, the lack of surprise when he finally enters his weeks-long death spiral doesn't hurt the moment any less, as it begins to dawn on the player that the character they've spent so much time falling in love with doesn't have long to live. Though it's perhaps what happens next that provides players with a much-needed surprise, because while Arthur's death is telegraphed loud and clear, what happens afterwards sure isn't. Children are precious commodities, both in the real world and in fiction. No one, unless you're a sicko, wants to see innocent kids succumb to death far too early. But Final Fantasy IV doesn't care about your feelings, and that's because its saddest and most emotional moment happens when twin mages Porum and Palom, both young children, sacrifice their lives to save the rest of the party, or so you're led to believe for a good portion of the adventure, until you find that they're alive and well after all. But imagine playing Final Fantasy IV for the first time and not knowing. It's harrowing stuff. That's what makes it so damn memorable. Final Fantasy IV's story is fairly complex and revolves a great deal around betrayal. Protagonist Cecil, with the help of his friend Kain, betray their military postings when they find out what their kingdom Baron is up to. Baron's king, in turn, betrays Cecil and Kain, forcing them to deliver what ends up being an explosive package that kills a town's worth of innocent people. And Kain himself betrays the party many times in schizophrenic routines that become annoying until you realize their root cause. More straightforward are the intentions of the various enemies you meet, who are out for blood. And it's after a battle with one of these fiends that Porum and Palom spring into action, showing that there's still decency and bravery in a dangerous world. The entire party is trapped in a room, surrounded by stone walls that are closing in on them. Porum and Palom, who are powerful magic users even though they're literally 6 years old in the game, decide to do the extraordinary, casting Petrify on themselves and turning each other into heavy statues that stop the walls from literally closing in. It's a self-inflicted death sentence for the kids, one that allows the party to continue onward, but without their most powerful mages. But near the end of the game, you learn that Porum and Palom live after all, liberated from stone by other powerful magicians. It's a brow wipe moment for many, though I must confess that it would have been far more powerful to have kept them dead. It makes you wonder if this was originally the intention, but it's something we'll never know for sure. 2012's Journey is one of the most powerful games I've ever played, and I doubt that'll ever change. Taking place among the ruins of a failed civilization, Journey puts us in the shoes of a lone so-called wanderer, trekking across a barren landscape. In the distance is a mountain, and on top of that mountain sits a light. We don't know what the nature of the light at the apex is for sure, but as if by magic we are pulled in that direction. We head towards it like a moth to the flame. It's a game that takes little time to complete, and for most of us it has no replay value, but it draws such sadness and despair out of some players, like me, that you may never quite shake the experience and what it really means, even if that, like so much, is up to interpretation. One of Journey's most interesting facets is its multiplayer functionality. If you're on the PSN when you play, you'll see other nameless wanderers also navigating the terrain, finding their way to the mountain in the distance at their own speed. You begin to develop impromptu relationships with those you encounter, even if you don't and can't know who they are. They'll come and go, some will stay with you for the duration, others will ignore you, and you won't see a list of who's who until you've beaten the game itself, where you might be surprised that the one or two wanderers you encountered and grouped up with ended up being many. The bond you develop with faceless, nameless strangers becomes so strong that by the end game you find yourself caring for them, limited to only basic, nonsensical communication and nothing more. The dangers you face together leave a mark, and when another player vanishes, a sense of loss lingers in the air. There's such a sad beauty to the entire experience, and throughout its duration, I'm not afraid to admit that I cried. Though nothing hit harder than the moment when I was trudging through the snow with my unnamed friend, and they dropped dead in front of me, only for my own avatar to quickly suffer the same fate. Such is Journey, a game that seems to be as much about life as death, and one of the most surprisingly powerful, resonant, and lasting experiences I've had in more than 30 years playing games.